Good day, friends. Jonathan Daugherty here with another edition of the PSR podcast. You know, we're a listener-supported outreach of Be Broken Ministries, and we exist to help individuals and families move from sexual brokenness to wholeness in Christ and equip others to do the same. In today's episode, I sit down with one of our favorite guests, Kat Etherington from the Naked Truth Project, to explore how early developmental trauma shapes addiction and relationships. Kat shares her personal recovery story and explains how childhood experiences, both big and small, can impact our sense of self and coping strategies. We discuss the importance of understanding both our emotional memories and objective truths, and why healing means digging deep into our pasts. Together, we're going to encourage you to move beyond blame and embrace the journey towards genuine healing and freedom. Visit nakedtruthproject.com for more resources from Kat and her team. For additional resources from us, you can visit our website at bebroken.org, or we're going to put a lot of links in today's show notes to help you take your next best step. And of course, friends, I'm going to invite you to please rate and review the podcast after listening to help others who are looking for this kind of content to find it. Now, let's go ahead and unpack today's conversation with Kat on understanding and addressing developmental trauma. Well, all right. We have back with us Kat Etherington. So, Kat, welcome back.
Hi, good to be here.
Yeah, so we've had you on a few times and talked about all different kinds of things from just the perspective of how to deal with, we talked about betrayal trauma once. We've also talked about just addiction and just recovery. And we talked about how couples can recover after there's been betrayal. Today's topic is really going to be about how early development trauma can impact addicts and their spouses. But before we get to that, I would love to let our new listeners kind of just know who you are a little bit and the kind of ministry that you do, and maybe just anything new that's been happening with you or the ministry.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. So my name's Kat Etherington. I am the recovery director for Naked Truth Project. Naked Truth Project is a UK-based but internationally operating non-profit organisation and ministry. And our sort of aim is to open eyes and free lives from the damaging impacts of pornography. We do that through a combination of what we call upstream and downstream work, which is based on that old story of when you pull enough people out of the river and save their lives, you should eventually start wandering upstream and finding out why so many people are falling in the river. And so our upstream work is that kind of opening eyes work. We do education and awareness in communities, with school children, with parents, and with churches, just kind of trying to start conversations around pornography and problematic sexual behavior and the pornification of our culture. And then the work that I do as Director for Recovery is overseeing a team of recovery practitioners working with clients who have been impacted by problematic sexual behavior and betrayal trauma. So we work with a whole bunch of people around the world, addicts, spouses, couples, and families as well. And so what's new with us? Not tons. We're just kind of doing the same stuff that we normally do. We are, for the first time this year, running some online intensive retreats, which is exciting. And so depending on when this is broadcast, maybe that will be relevant to some of your listeners. But yeah, just kind of plodding on, really.
Yeah, I'm sorry that I actually asked the question that I hate to get asked the most, like, what's new? What's new? What's new? And sometimes it's like, you know, we sort of have lanes that we operate in, and we just keep doing the work that we're supposed to be doing. And sometimes there's just an ongoing nature to that. It doesn't always have to be something new,
we're
right?
not short of things to do, Jonathan. I can tell you that for sure.
Exactly. Yeah. Same here. And I love the upstream, downstream thing. You know, for years we were dealing with, you know, men who had unwanted sexual behaviors and then their wives. And so we were dealing with those downstream issues. And about 5 or 6 years ago is when we started our family care arm of our ministry, which really is that upstream, that prevention and education, and saying, how can we help families to really raise the next generation so that we're not having to deal with, you know, somebody with a 20 or 30-year porn addiction when they're in their 30s and 40s. So I love that. We're tracking very much on the same page in that respect. Well, I wanted to, you know, today's topic is one that is, as you do this work, you realize there's a lot of trauma in a lot of people's histories that leads to things that are part of their current circumstance.
Mm-hmm.
So, first of all, I just want to try to get a high level view of how would you describe what early developmental trauma even is? Like, what are some examples of what that might be?
Yeah, and I think that's a really important question to ask, because I guess one of the reasons I wanted to talk about this topic is because one of the most common questions that people in recovery or people who are married to people in recovery have is like, why do I do the things that I do? And for many clients, the answer can be found in this concept of developmental trauma. And so what I would say about sort of defining that is that the clue is in the name to a certain extent. So, developmental trauma is trauma that happens at a stage of life that interrupts or interferes with our development. So, that's typically childhood and early adolescence, maybe into later adolescence, even that the developmental nature of that period of time is interrupted by traumatic experiences. And so, what that looks like in practical terms is what you would hear sort of referred to in the recovery world as family of origin issues. So, and
Mhm.
they could be what we might call big T traumas. That is things that are easily recognized as traumatic. So things like abuse and overt neglect. Those kinds of things would fall into the category of developmental trauma if they happen during that period of development. But it could also include what you might consider as little t traumas, which is the stuff that feels normal when it's happening to you because it is just part of your lived experience, but that actually, in the context of what healthy looks like, may be unhealthy family dynamics. And so, as a person in recovery from addiction myself, one of the things that I have understood about my own story is that whilst I actually don't have a big T trauma story, I have sufficient experiences of little t traumatic dynamics that sort of landed up with me in a place where I had picked up some ideas about who I was, how I function in the world, and my value and worth. And that kind of comes more from those low level family dynamics.
Yeah. So as you're saying that, I was thinking even in my own story, and I'd love to get your feedback on this of if I've categorized these right. I consider that my surprise exposure to pornography, I was not expecting this as a 12-year-old kid, and I had a friend show this to me. And I put that in the big T trauma because it just overwhelmed my system completely. I did not know how to handle that. I'd never been told about pornography, and it was a scary yet exhilarated, like sort of short circuited my whole emotional and biological system at the
Right.
time when I hit that. But I also feel like that because I grew up in the church, sometimes when I look back on it, I was experiencing what we might call spiritual bypassing. So there were either topics or some things that the way that they were addressed was we don't go there. And so we have a verse to just say, this is what it means. And so I think that may be kind of the little t trauma. That was just part of the kind of the lived experience of, well, men don't have emotions and, you're just a
Right.
doer and so anyway, I don't know if that's a way to maybe differentiate where you might put a big T or a little t trauma.
Yeah, and I think at least for some of my clients, it's helpful to think about big T traumas are typically the things that are easily validated, in the sense that when a big T trauma happens, usually everybody knows. If you are involved in a crime, if you're the victim of a crime, that's usually a big T trauma. Everybody can see that that's happened. There's no ambiguity around it. It was a thing that happened to you that may leave you traumatized. Whereas little t traumas are exactly as you described it. That's like a cultural way of being, or a cultural narrative that might exist within a church or a family, or a wider social group that maybe nobody is recognizing, but that is having a negative impact. So one of the little t trauma stories that my family was present in my family was the unspoken idea that if you didn't toe the line and behave in a particular way, if you weren't conforming, that maybe there was a withdrawal of love and affection and approval. And so those things, when they happen occasionally, are normal parts of childhood development. But those things, when they happen all day, every day, begin to you begin to internalize what that means about the world. And so for me, that sort of low level parental disapproval results in a developmental trauma that is about not being able to be myself. And so that will lead to shame.
Yeah. Now we know just from like life and just even relationships and everything that not every single person who has experienced developmental trauma is automatically destined to become an addict, right? Or
Right.
to become addicted. But then what are the connections though between developmental trauma? What kind of connections can there have between that and somebody then becoming involved in some kind of compulsive behavior?
Yeah. So, I
How do
mean,
they link together?
that's a good question, because I think for people who are in addiction, or people who have been hurt by somebody else's addiction, it can feel like, oh, well, they're doing it because they're traumatized, is a little bit of a kind of cop out, or a bypass of responsibility, because, well, not everybody who has developmental trauma goes on to be an addict. What I can probably say, categorically, is that everybody who has developmental trauma has developed some coping strategies that help them to navigate life while holding the outcomes of that trauma. And when I think about my addiction story, I guess my kind of segue into addictive behavior really was opportunistic. I wasn't going out seeking to become addicted to anything, but the substance that I was using came into my life unexpectedly, just like you described with pornography. And it was the most effective strategy for managing that unhealed trauma that I had ever found. Now, if I had never come across that, then I would have used other strategies, and they may not have included addiction. I think probably one of the primary strategies that people adopt for developmental trauma is people pleasing, kind of going through
Mm.
life, bending themselves out of shape and giving away the truth of their identity to the people around them, because often as children, that is the safest way to navigate an unsafe family or an unsafe culture or group, or whatever that is. So you talked about spiritual bypassing. What you're describing there is a learned behavior. You have learned that it is not acceptable to ask the questions or to share the doubts. And when we learn that, we are faced with a question of, well, do I do that thing which might feel like it's the right thing to do, and risk being shunned from the group, or do I put up and shut up and conform to the culture? And that's kind of like a form of people pleasing. So I'm going to say, like, people pleasing is probably one of the primary ways that shows up.
Well, and as you're saying that, one of the things that really strikes me is that we don't have to learn that identity is central to our being, right? It's almost like you're saying when these traumas happen, we almost instinctively, intuitively know that we need some kind of equilibrium to know who we are.
Right.
Why is maybe that important to understand, especially as we get later in the conversation to what do we do about this? Like if this has been part of your history, maybe there's unhealed trauma or whatever. How does the identity piece play into that? And why is that such an important part of this conversation?
Yeah, that's a really great question, because that's what childhood development is about. It's about growing into the knowledge of who I am, what I think and believe about the world, how I want to operate within the world. And when the relationships around us, particularly with our parents or caregivers, are not fully safe to explore that and to make mistakes, and because that's how children learn, isn't it? We learn to walk by trying to walk and falling down and standing back up and having somebody cheer us on and wipe off the dirt from our knees. And this is the development of identity is a very similar proposition, and the quality of the relationships around us will determine how much of that falling down and getting up and being supported and exploring is available to us. And so if we grow up in an environment where we have maybe an insecure parent who is easily triggered by our making mistakes because they have an internal condition of shame, then we will learn that making mistakes is not acceptable to our parent. And then we're faced with a really difficult proposition, because the attachment bond with our caregiver is threatened. And as a child, that is like an existential threat, right? Like, if my mum doesn't love me, what does that mean to a child? And so intuitively, which is the word you used, and I like that word, intuitively, we understand that we have to do something to reconnect with the parent. And often that means that we take the shape that they need us to take to be acceptable to them. But when we do that over and over and over again, at the cost of stuffing down our authentic experience, then we give away our sense of identity to the people around us. So when I got into recovery from my own addiction, I started taking drugs when I was 16, and I got into recovery when I was 26. And I really, really remember hearing this kind of idea that I was going to find myself, and being like, oh, okay, this is good. I'm going to find myself. And I, kind of started this recovery journey, and it didn't take me very, very long to realize that for me there was actually no self to find, because I had spent so much of my life pretending to be somebody to meet the needs of the people around me, that I had never really formed my sense of identity to begin with. And so that felt quite scary, but it also felt like a really great opportunity, because the question I was then faced with was, okay, so who do I want to be now? So I think that identity question is really central in terms of how developmental trauma interrupts our ability to build a solid sense of self.
Now, anytime we have these kind of conversations, especially in the world in which we are living now, where this is a huge topic in terms of identity, how important is it to realize that there is a difference between subjective reality and objective reality when it comes to two things: this conversation about identity, but also thinking about, is there not an objective way to understand what healthy development actually looks like from childhood to adulthood? And the reason I ask this question, Kat, is because I think so many times we're trying to correct what maybe was done through a strictly authoritarian type of a way to do life and relationships, that we swing the pendulum so far to the other side that we say it's all subjective. So where is the balance? And I'm thinking about parents right now, especially, who are raising their kids and realizing, I don't want to flat out deny the subjective experience that my kids are having, but I also want them to recognize there are objective truths and realities in life. And so how do you navigate that? Maybe the better way to ask the question is, when we're thinking about parents and trying to help their kids grow up, what's a good healthy way to understand what healthy development looks like?
Yeah.
Because we're talking about trauma and things, and that's the way that the system gets broken. But maybe
Yeah. No,
dive
I
into
think
that
I
idea of
understand
the
what you're
balance between
asking.
objective and subjective.
Yeah, and I think at the risk of giving a what might be considered a political answer, I would wonder if those are the right questions, because for me there's a question about less about kind of what's objectively or subjectively true. I think even when it comes to, even if you put a box of objective truth down in the room, each of us will still experience that objective truth through our subjective reality and our own experience and biases and all of those things. So for me, at least, as a parent and as a therapist working with clients with developmental trauma, I'm more interested in what's authentic than what is objective, because that's really all that each of us have. So there is I guess take an experience that we hear about a lot when we do family of origin work, which might be something like, my dad, when I was growing up, was working really, really hard because we didn't have a lot of money and he needed to put in all the extra hours to put food on the table. I think you could argue that objectively, dad is doing a good thing. Like he's providing for his family their most basic of needs, and like that's a good thing for dad to be doing. And the subjective experience that a child may have of that is that dad's not around. And that's still their experience, whether dad's not around for good reasons or bad reasons. And so I think one of the things that I'm interested in when I'm working with clients around family of origin stories and experiences is to sort of bypass the logical, cognitive pieces of the story. Because as adults, we're really able to do that objective reality piece. We're able to look at a situation and say, well, yes, of course, dad wasn't around. But as children, we don't have that capacity. We don't have that opportunity. And
Mm-hmm.
so the truth is as much in my felt experience of that as it is in what the objective truth of why that was happening is. And so there is a balance to be had there. But yeah, maybe that doesn't totally answer your question.
Yeah, you know what? I love what you're saying, because one of the things that we teach in our weekend intensive workshop that we do for men is we do a lot of story work, and we are
Mm-hmm.
going back into family of origin issues and dealing with traumas. And one of the things I always tell the guys is, you can't go back into that experience and try to overlay your current adult knowledge onto what you experienced as a kid. In other words, wherever the shame landed, wherever the trauma landed, you were experiencing that through the lens of a 7-year-old or a
Right.
12-year-old. And so in many ways, you have to go back in order to heal. You have to start at that very subjective place. And so I think maybe what I'm hearing you say is, listen, in order to heal well from these developmental traumas, we can't start exclusively from this objective cognitive place.
Right.
We have to start from where the felt reality was. And I do think there's a maturing as you go through a healing process. Your eyes might start to be open to a sense of, oh, you know what? I see what some underpinning objective realities are. But to get there, I have to go through the reality of what I experienced through the lens I experienced it.
Of a child, absolutely, because that
Absolutely.
developmental trauma lives in the emotional memory and the nervous system memory. It doesn't live in the cognitive memory. And so when you try to
Mm-hmm.
go through an adult perspective to heal a childhood wound, that really just doesn't work, because you're doing the adult thing with it, and the woundedness is almost, that idea of inner child. That's that kind of inner child piece of you that is stuck with the subjective experience of truth that you had.
Yeah, one maybe we can actually maybe I'll just throw out maybe a real
Mm,
example here to help describe a little bit of what we're talking about here. I believe there is an objective truth that you objectively are worth health. You're objectively loved by God. There's certain of these things that I believe are objective truths.
hmm
But when you were telling about your own story, when you've had when those have not been the predominant messages that have been given to you by your primary caregivers, can you just immediately receive that because somebody says that to you?
Right. You don't have an in for it.
Yeah. And so maybe that's part of what the healing looks like is you can't somebody, maybe a well-meaning counselor could even say to you, Kat, you are loved. You are objectively worth recovery or whatever the truth may be. And you're not going to get there
Yeah.
until somebody walks with you back to that place where you go, but I don't see myself as worthy. I do not see myself as loved. I have to continually bend my own self to be able to be accepted by others. I'm not just
Right.
accepted for who I am. So let's talk a little bit about healing. Like, what does it look like then for the person who, listen, they're an adult now and they're either addicted or they're married to someone who's addicted. And these are components of their history.
Yeah.
As part
Yeah.
of the recovery process, what does healing from development trauma look like?
Yeah, thank you for asking that too. I do just want to say something about what you said just before, because it really brought up a memory for me of, I've been in recovery for 16 years. I've done a lot of different types of therapy through that time, and became a Christian, and all of those things. And even as recently as sort of five or so years ago, I can remember being in therapy, kind of when had something new had come up that I'm like, okay, I think I'll go work through that. And I can remember a therapist asking me the question, what would you say to that younger version of yourself? And I know what I'm supposed to say to that question. I know I'm supposed to say, I would tell her that she's worthy. And I also know that that younger version of myself doesn't have a way to take that truth in, because
Mm.
the subjective experience that I've had is sends a different message. And so what I actually ended up saying to my therapist is, there's nothing I can say to her that she is going to take on board right now. And that's kind of like the truth of that early developmental trauma experience for me. And that makes me think about, you're probably familiar with the work of Diane Langberg. She does a lot of work around trauma and theology. And she talks about how, as children, we understand abstract concepts, things like love, things like grace, even things like God, through our concrete experiences that we have on earth. And
Mm-hmm.
so, if our parent is trying to love us in a way that is hurtful to us, and they're calling that love, then we get really confused about what love even is, because our only experience of love is a hurtful experience. And so, those objective ideas become subjective experiences depending on the concrete messages that have been sent to us around them. So, with that as a preface, I think the work of healing, for me, I describe it as like, because my story was a little T trauma story. I describe my journey of healing from that as a bit like an archaeological dig. Like, there was nothing really obvious and easy to find, and so instead I had to get out a little paintbrush and a little puffball and kind of wipe off all of the experiences that I'd had as a child, looking for pieces that made some kind of sense. And so, for sure, things like story work, engaging with the narratives of your childhood. I think for men in recovery, there is work to do around masculine narratives and what it means to be a man, and what I've learned about gender roles, and even for betrayed partners. So my story is, I had my own addiction, and then I married a man who had problematic sexual behavior, and I've probably found more healing in my healing from betrayal trauma than I did in my
Mm.
healing from addiction. And that's because it's confronted me with new questions. And so, yeah, kind of getting back into the story of your childhood. I think the thing that's most impactful in doing that is some of the more experiential methods. So we can talk about and intellectualize our childhood all day long, and not really see any meaningful progress. But when you get into things like inner child work and story work that invites you into a more kind of body based experiential work, that's when I see people doing better with that stuff, because it doesn't live in our heads, it lives in our nervous system, in our body, and in our emotional memory.
Right. How important is it when somebody starts to navigate doing what we call this story work? How important is it for them to realize that this is about their healing and not trying to find someone to blame in their history,
Mhm.
or try to pass off, like, because this person hurt me, because that happened? Why is it important to recognize it's a journey of their own healing? And I see it especially in people who have a story similar to yours, where they go, there was nothing overt.
Right.
And so I feel like you're making me go on a witch hunt to try to find some trauma in my past. What would you say to the person that is either um, blind to maybe the wounds that they've had in their past, or is thinking more in that blame mentality?
Mhm.
How would you help them navigate this from a
Yeah.
place of, it's about your healing and not those other things?
And that is hard. It is hard, especially if part of your developmental trauma is that you have been um, kind of trained within your family of origin to keep the peace and not rock the boat and not upset
Hmm.
anybody. Like, it's going to feel um, really, really challenging to begin to assign responsibility for those things. And maybe that's a better word than blame, because a lot of people do come, even like they spend money and they come to our family of origin intensive, and you ask them to tell you about their childhood and they say it was fine. And I always
Yeah.
say, well, then why are you here? Like, there's something in you that knows that it's not fine, or there's something in you that really wants to try to understand how you got to where you got to. And so there's a couple of things that I typically would say to people. And one is about that subjective childhood experience that your parents could be, or your caregivers, or whoever has hurt you, could be acting from a really good place. I really believe that. There was a thing that my dad used to say to me often, which was when I would take an emotional experience to him, something that was difficult for me, he would say to me, "Oh, don't be silly. You don't have to feel that."
Mm.
And what
Mm.
I know as a grown up is that that was an attempt to love me. Actually, it was an attempt to support me. It was an attempt to help me avoid feeling bad feelings. And it didn't help me develop a resilience to difficult emotions. And it didn't help me feel like I could communicate my emotions authentically. And that later on led to me suppressing all sorts of emotional experiences. And so I think what we want for people is to be able to acknowledge that even when our parents or caregivers are doing the very best that they can do, and not all of them do the very best that they can do, sometimes those big T traumas
Hmm.
are overt, but when they're less overt, someone can be kind and thinking that they're being kind, and at the same time that kindness can be not what we needed in that moment and can be damaging to us. And so I think, yeah, we definitely want to get away from blame, and we want to get to what is the truth of your lived experience, because that's where
Right.
your challenges are, and that's also where your freedom is.
Yeah, that's one of the things we say all the time. This is not a journey to go blame. It's a journey to reveal the truth
Hmm.
and go on a journey for your own healing and your own well-being. I love what you said about how, folks that come into your intensives and they go, "I had a great childhood." And you're like, "Well, what's the deal?" But you're right. I think a lot of times what they're saying in that is, I cannot, through my eyes, see anything that was of a
Absolutely.
great, like massive, obvious thing. And yet, when you start digging into their story, so many of the times what you hear is, okay, there's actually a lot of structural dysfunction here
Yeah.
and relational dysfunction and disconnect. So this has been a great conversation. Obviously, we could go on all day long. I want to ask you one more question.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of the person who's listening right now and they're going, I'm kind of resonating with what you're saying. Maybe I did have some big T trauma in my history, or I realize there is a connection to things in my past, but they're struggling to see the value in going back there and really, maybe in their view, digging up things that they've thought the journey is all forward. I just need to bury that and keep moving forward. What hope and maybe encouragement would you give to that person so that they would realize this is valuable work to heal from
Yeah.
whatever those developmental traumas were?
Yeah, I love that you asked that question, because I was 100% that person. I couldn't easily point to something in my history that would make sense of my experience. And I'll tell you what that did for me is, first of all, it made me feel more ashamed. So I actually went to residential treatment a couple of times, and I sat in group therapy, and there were some big T traumas in that group. And that was an easy thing to make sense of. Oh, they're here because this thing happened to them. And because I didn't have that story, what my immediate experience was, well, then really I must just be a bad person, because those bad things didn't
Mm.
happen to me. And so there's no reason for me to be the way that I am. And so I must be a bad person. And so making sense of that, first of all, gave me some freedom from that feeling of there's something really wrong with me, which I had carried through my whole life. And I think, secondly, what I've really come to understand is that, and Jonathan, having been around addiction recovery for 16 years, one of the biggest shames that I see, in the sense that it's a shame that this happens to people, is that lots of people stop short of doing this kind of work, and they're not acting out, they're not using pornography, they're not drinking alcohol, they're not taking drugs anymore, but they're not truly free because they're continuing to live in those old stories, those old narratives, even those old behaviors. And for me, healing and freedom really came when I stopped replaying the developmental trauma of my childhood. I stopped seeking to have my needs met by people who could never meet them. I stopped replaying dysfunctional dynamics from my family within my relationships and friendships and church community. And so I would say this is the place where real freedom, long lasting freedom that goes way beyond addiction and into just what does it mean to live truthfully and honestly, and in a way that I get to really know who I am. So I get it. This is hard work. It's scary work. Why does anybody want to dig up the dead bodies that they've had buried in the garden forever? But the truth is, when you have a dead body buried in your garden, if it rains hard enough, that body's going to float to the top, right? And so like that's going to happen, and it's going to keep happening until we get in there and get rid of it.
Yeah, one of the ways that I like to describe it is in the recovery process, sobriety is really the gateway to the deeper work that you can do to really experience freedom. In other words, I like what you said. Sometimes people stop at sobriety, like I'm not acting out, and think that that was the ultimate goal. When I feel like that's the entry point to this work where you can really experience freedom and wholeness. So, Kat, this has been, again, a great conversation. Where can our listeners and viewers go to just learn more about the resources that you provide?
Yeah, so you can find us at nakedtruthproject.com, and there are different drop-down options there where you can learn about our education and awareness work, and you can look at our recovery resources, and we have various programs for men, women, and couples all around the world.
That's great. Well, Kat, as always, thank you for taking your time to share with us today. It's been really valuable.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Jonathan.
Yeah. Well, listeners and viewers, we're going to put all that information in the show notes so that you have it, good access to that. Our job is to help you take your next best step towards wholeness in Christ and really experiencing that freedom we were talking about. And so if this resonated with you and you realize as we said, I've got some bodies buried in the backyard of my life, we wanted to help you take that next best step. So please reach out to us, and we look forward to seeing you back here again next time on the Pure Sex Radio program. Take care.
Pure Sex Radio is paid for by Be Broken Ministries. Visit us online at puresexradio.com.